Today I'm going to be talking about arguments, the good kind of arguments. Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. If it is your first time here, How to Write Good is a writing podcast that seeks to find principles and advice that can be applied across a broad range of writing situations. If you've been here before, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button below, and share. So in my last few episodes, I've been talking about logic. So if you haven't listened to the 3 episodes that came before this, I would suggest you do that first before listening to this one, because all 4 of these go together, and I think that you don't get the full picture of what I'm trying to get across. You can find them up here or in the description if you're just listening to this. So we are continuing our discussion on logic. The first step in the logical process, if you want to call it a step, is defining things. It's making definitions. It's trying to find what the core of a thing is. And these definitions we're creating can be either ambiguous or unambiguous. And the second step is probably the easiest step to understand, and that is making statements. We say something about something, and these statements can either be true or false. And the logical process is built kind of like a pyramid. We start with something more foundational at the bottom, and we need that first step before we move on to the second step, and we need that second step before we move on to the first step. And again, I know I've reiterated this multiple times, but I just want to say that the first step of figuring out what something is, of defining something, is extremely important in this process. So after we've figured out what we're talking about, and we've started to make statements about that thing we are talking about, we're moving on to step 3. Step 3 is making arguments. So what do I mean by arguments? Well, we need to first define what we're talking about, going back to step 1. An argument isn't me yelling at someone else or telling them they're stupid or telling them they're wrong. It is actually a very specific thought process. Another word you could use for argument is a syllogism. So for those of you who do not know what a syllogism is, it is 3 statements. It is similar to saying if this and this, then this. And we're coming to a logical conclusion about something based on these statements. So we have statement 1, we have statement 2, and then we have the conclusion statement that pulls these 2 statements together to make a conclusion based off those first 2 statements. It's actually a really simple process to understand, but it is not necessarily a simple process to apply. And the reason why I say it's not a simple process to apply, because there's a lot of pitfalls as you go through this logical process, okay? But it is a very simple process to understand. First, you have the definitions. You're trying to figure out what you're trying to talk about. Then you have the statements. Then you put these statements together to make arguments based on these statements. So arguments look like this within logic. Like I said, very simple to understand, harder to apply. Here's one argument that I might make. All fruit is edible. Apples are fruit. Apples are edible. That is a syllogism. That is a basic logical argument. Here's another argument I might have as well. All buildings are man-made. Houses are buildings. Houses are man-made. It's very simple. It has 3 parts. You would call it a syllogism. You can also call it a logical argument. Now, when we look at these 2 logical arguments I've just stated, or these 2 syllogisms I've talked about, we'd have to dig into whether these are actually good. So we'd first look at the terms we're using. What is meant by all? What is meant by fruit? What is meant by edible? If we are talking about certain animals can eat things that a human cannot eat. So if we're talking about what is edible for a cow, that is going to be different than what is edible for a human. And what is edible for a human is not edible for a dog. For instance, chocolate kills dogs, for what I understand. We also need to know what is an apple. How are we defining an apple? How are we defining fruits? Some people might disagree on what is a fruit and what isn't a fruit. So we need to look into all those different things. So it is a complex process. And if we only have this basic syllogism, it's not as complex. But what I've talked about before in these past few episodes is that with the logical process, we are actually taking statements. We're putting those statements together into arguments. We're coming to conclusions about those statements because of those arguments. And then we're building more statements off of those conclusions, and we keep on going on with this thing. There was a famous philosopher that you probably know. You were probably taught about this philosopher at some point. Rene Descartes has this very famous, what I would say is an argument. He says, I think, therefore I am. He says that if you think, you must be. I think, therefore I am. But he shortens it to I think, therefore I am. What he was trying to do is he was trying to get back to the most basic thing he could actually know. And he knew that he thought, and since he knew that he thought, he also knew that he existed. And what he did is he took that idea and he kept on building off that idea to figure out what he knew he could know based on that one idea. Now, some of you may not agree with his conclusions. I think there's a lot of people who probably do not agree with the conclusions he made based off that basic argument, that original argument. But that's the same idea. You're not necessarily going back to the most basic thing you can know about reality, but you can go back to things that you believe are almost certainly true, or you can go back to foundational things about what you've experienced. Now, it isn't just what you're experiencing that you're basing arguments off of, but this is what we're doing as writers. This is what we're doing as creatives. If you want to call us artists, this is what we're doing. People who are in an artistic field are taking their experiences, are taking those things they most tightly hold to themselves, and they're displaying them in some form for other people to experience as well. So we are taking that small kernel and we're building off that small kernel to get to something that makes logical sense, to get to something that makes sense to another person, right? And saying something makes sense and saying something makes logical sense is the same thing. Now, I put so much emphasis on logic because I don't think logic is just something people made up. I think logic is like mathematics. I think it's built into our world. And if logic is built into our world, you are not the only one experiencing logic in our world. Here's one example of logic playing out in the world and people understanding that logic exists in some form in the world. We move through time. We experience things in time. We know that we are born, we grow up, we get older, we become adults, and eventually we're going to die. And we base our lives and how we work through our lives off this idea, off this experience of time existing. This is also prevalent in the movement of seasons. People throughout the history of the world, the earliest humans, what they did is they saw how the seasons moved. They determined what happened in each season. They saw how the stars moved, and they put everything together logically, and they said, if we do things at certain times, we're going to have enough food to get through the winter, or we're going to have enough food to get through the dry season, or whatever type of season they needed to go through. So every type of human has had to put together a logical structure based off of what they saw. They said, this makes sense. This is what we're going to do next. And there's a lot of other ways they do this as well. In your own personal relationship, you do this every single day, but you probably don't even notice it. If somebody does something to you, or if somebody doesn't talk to you that you know really well, you might jump to a conclusion that they are angry with you. That is you going through some sort of logical process to come to that end result. Like I said, this is built into how we work, and if you can get closer to taking that kernel of an idea or an experience and building it up logically, or understanding your own experiences in a way that you can convey to somebody else, and I think the only way you do that is through logic. If you can do that, you're going to have an easier time, a better time of actually taking those ideas and putting them into writing. So how does the argument itself work when we look at writing? Because you might think, well, definitions really help, because when I look at a definition, I can just figure out what something is and take that and put it into my writing. And statements, to a certain degree, help as well, but how do arguments? How does this three-step process of statement, conclusion actually help in my writing? I think there's smaller things this helps within your writing, but I think there's something very big this does. I think this actually shifts how you think about things. I think this actually helps you see the world more clearly. What it does is it takes you from this very shallow understanding of the world. It takes you from this place where you're working within the world and making bad conclusions about the world or what's happening, and it allows you to expand your mind. It may sound odd, but logic actually helps you be a better lateral thinker. But if you think about it, it actually does make sense that it would do that, because if I want to know more about science and I have no understanding of science, if I've never studied science, I can't think within the paradigm of science. I can't think about things scientifically, right? That makes a lot of sense. I can't study things and know things as they actually are, or even if I can see them in some cases as they actually are, I'm still making a guess in the dark because I have no apparatus with which I can test those different things I see. The same thing is with logic, right? Logic isn't perfect because the human mind isn't perfect and there are limits to our thinking. But logic is similar because we're looking at life, we're looking at the world, we're looking at ideas, and we're trying to understand them in a way that is as clear as possible. And logic allows us to do that in the same way that the scientific method allows us to see things scientifically. Now, when you're dealing with logic and art, it can be the case that you go overboard with it. I definitely think that you can do that, but I think that it is something that is so lacking in our society, and it's so lacking in artists' understanding of the world, so that it's actually something we need more of. Because if we have tons of artists who do not know how to navigate the world, and they're making things, and they're coming to wrong conclusions, and they have this fuzzy understanding of the world, so they create art based on this fuzzy understanding of the world, I don't actually think they're going to be creating as good of art. Now, it may be the case that some of them stumble on art and they make very, very good art, but I think that's more of a chance. And even if you have an argument against all types of artists picking up logic and understanding, trying to understand the world better, I think that there is certainly an argument to be made that we as writers need to understand logic and we need to apply it and we need to learn how it works, get familiar with it so that we do view the world differently. We do view the world through a more logical lens. Now, before I go, I just want to say that I do not discount emotion. People have both a logical side and an emotional side, and I do a lot of writing and I do a lot of fiction writing. And one of the parts of writing fiction is understanding emotional things and conveying things so that people understand those emotional things as well. So I don't discount emotion at all. But I do think it is the case that within our arts, we have pushed ourselves so far into emotion. We have pushed ourselves so far onto that side that we actually neglect orderly things. And the artistic world has neglected orderly things so much that in some cases people will say anything is art. And I don't think that's true because it doesn't make any sense whatsoever to say that anything is art. Because if anything is art, it really doesn't matter what art is. It's not something special, and I want art to be something special, and I think art is something special. I think it reaches us in a way that other things can't because it approaches the world in a way that other things can't. And though that experience of living, though that side of things that is filled with emotion and that is messy is very good to be connected to, we also need to be connected to order. Because art isn't just trying to do stuff. I truly believe that art is trying to get to the bottom of the human experience. And the human experience is in flux, but it's also connected to order as well. It's not one or the other. We're not something that can just be something else. We can't turn ourselves into a butterfly. We are connected to a body, we're connected to a physical space, but at the same time we have tremendous potential. And I think that art reflects that in a way that nothing else does. And if we want to understand the human being better, if we want to understand the human experience better, I think that we need to actually take into account the fact that the experience of any one person is multifaceted. And then you have 7 billion people on Earth, so the experience of all those different people are multifaceted, and think of how complex each individual person is, and think of all the different experiences that arise out of humanity. But we all have that core of humanity. If you enjoyed this, you're probably wondering how you can support me. Well, you can actually do two simple things. Follow the first link below to grab a copy of my book, and then follow the second link and sign up for my newsletter. It's that simple. Those two things will mean the world to me and give me more time to write books and create content for you. As always, my name is Daniel Poppie, and this is How to Write Good.